Shelley has been a gardener all her life, starting as an apprentice to her grandpa in Moncton. Her grandpa had a motto, and the motto was, only eat food that rots and eat it before it rots. That was his motto. So I thought that was pretty good. Shelley gardens at her home here in Fredericton, and she has a huge garden and a greenhouse and cold frames, which she introduced this year, the cold frames. Tonight she's going to talk about gardening for success. That's the title of the workshop, and it's about easy to grow crops and how to plan your plot. So I'd like you to all welcome Shelley Cronk. Thank you.
So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I have a cold, so if I start to cough, I apologize in advance. So gardening. I've been a gardener my whole life. And one of the things that I quickly figured out, working alongside my grandfather and then my mother, and then having a husband who's a soil geologist, geochemist, is that it doesn't really matter anything that you do. You can try anything and you can do anything, but if you don't look after your soil, you might as well stop. That's the most important resource that you have, is your soil. And the best way to manage your soil, of course, is by composting. Composting has all kinds of good reasons to do it, but the best reason to compost I think one of the best reasons to compost is that it gives you the most return. It is your most valuable resource. So looking after your soil resource should be your number one priority. I'm sure most of you know that why compost is superior to chemical fertilizers, right? If you're using chemical fertilizers, it's like giving your plants drugs. You'll give them this wonderful burst of amazing things, and they'll either grow too fast and then they crash, right? So it's like, hurry up, grow, crash, right? And that's the worst cycle for plants, right? Plants need a nice, steady nutrition. And so one of the ways to garden for success is to start with things that are not such heavy feeders. So while you're figuring out how to manage your soil, if you start with plants that are easier on your soil and some plants that actually add back to your soil, that's a good way to start. So when you're looking at first and foremost your soil, and then you have to look at where your piece of land is. What is your piece of land? What does it look like? How much light does it get? What's your neighbor going to grow? How can you maybe work together with your neighbor to understand how much space you have? So once you kind of look at, okay, I have this much space, well, if you've never gardened before, you really don't have a lot of idea about how do you figure out, how much room does a bean plant need, or how much room does a tomato plant need, or what's the best way to grow spinach anyway, right? So one of the places, of course, to get information is seed packets. There's lots of information on most seed packets. Of course, I'll give you the example of the one that has no information on it. But most of the time, you're not going to buy huge packets of seeds, right? If you're planting, I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, so packet information. So if, for example, I'll put on my other glasses so I can read here. This one is for basil. I love basil. Great for lots of things. So it says planting. So herbs require well-drained, well-cultivated soil in full sun, right? So it gives you planting instructions. It actually gives you harvest instructions and storage instructions on this seed packet. This one will tell you, this gives you planting instructions, growing instructions, harvesting instructions, pest and disease, companion planting, right? So there's a variety of information on your seed packet. So use that when you're looking. The other place to get information on plants, I don't work for Vessie's, but I do use Vessie seed. So when you're looking through a seed guide, it'll also give you all kinds of information. How tall is this plant going to grow? Am I going to need to support it? Will it support itself? All those kinds of things. On the back of these big packets of seeds, these are quite interesting because they'll actually have a variety of information on them on all, I grow a lot of beans, as you can tell. You're probably not going to buy this many bean seeds. But on the back, it gives you planting information for a variety of plants, including when you can plant them, how much seed you need for a given area, right? So, I mean, if you've never planted beans before, you wouldn't know, like, do I need 10 bean seeds for the, you know, do I need 10? Do I need 20? Do I need 100, right? So a lot of that information you can find on your seed packages. So you get your piece of land and you look at it. Now, if you've never gardened before, one of the really intimidating things about gardening is, like I say, knowing how much seed to buy. So before you decide how much seed to buy or what you're going to buy, you should think about, well, what are some of the things that I like to eat is a good one. Another one is I look at things that are expensive but are really yummy fresh. So herbs. Herbs are one of those things, they're really expensive in supermarket. Most of them, unlike other things now, it's really hard to find organic ones. But herbs are really, for the most part, quite easy to grow and very versatile, right? And they're a good starting crop for beginners because most of them are pretty straightforward. So that would be one place to start. So are they expensive? Are they really much better fresh? And is it something that I eat often and will grow continually? So for example, three crops I grow a lot of: Swiss chard, a variety of lettuce, and spinach. And the reason I grow those crops is they're really nutritious, fresh, they're really good. Lettuce can be a heavier feeder than some of the other ones, but they're not super heavy feeders, so if your soil isn't built up really, really well yet, they're probably going to thrive. But what I love about those crops is you can plant, so for example, I would start and I'll plant spinach early, and then I'll plant some spinach, and then 2 weeks later I'll plant some more spinach, and then 2 weeks later I'll plant some more spinach. And you can't do it through the heat of the summer, it doesn't grow well, but you can do that through the early part of the year, and you can start again in August. So it's one of those things, you can continually be replenishing it, and you can continually be using it so you feel successful, right? It's an easy crop to grow, and it's something that you're going to get a lot of use out of. You can cook it, you can eat it raw, right? It's a really good, nutritious green, and all the greens are really, Swiss chard is a great one because Swiss chard doesn't bolt. So spinach and a lot of the lettuce will bolt. And what that means is, when the growing conditions don't suit it, it will all of a sudden go to seed really quickly on you. And then you have to cut it. But again, if you've got a small row of it, and that happens, you know that you can reseed it again, and in a very little while, you'll have, 2-3 weeks, you'll have another crop coming up, right? So it's not like you put your tomato plant in, and we get a windstorm, and the tomato plant breaks off, then you're sunk, right? So those things are more difficult to grow. They're not great they have a lot of pests and a lot of disease, and they take a lot of room for a small yield. So that's why the other reason I like the greens is because you get really high yield for very little space. There's a lot of heirloom varieties of those. If you're looking for, well, what's an heirloom variety? An heirloom variety is something where you could actually save the seed, right? It's an older variety, it hasn't been, so for example, if I'm growing a hybrid, if I save the seed from a hybrid, who knows what you're going to get next time. You might get the same thing, you might get one of the things that were breeded to make that plant. Most of the time, if it's squash, you get something, you might as well just pull it up because it's never anything edible. It can be very interesting. So growing heirloom varieties, they tend to have, if it's something that has been grown here for a long time, it's usually grown because, like my grandfather, he grew stuff that didn't get bugged by the pests. It was one of the lessons he taught me, like, why fight them, right? If you have something that grows really well, and you know the bugs aren't going to attack, well, pick that to grow. Don't grow the stuff that you know you're going to spend your whole life fighting. You know, you're going to spend all this time trying to get the disease out of it, right? So heirloom varieties are important for a lot of reasons. They're kind of like soil health. They help with sustainability, right? And they help to protect the genetic diversity of the crops, so that if we came to a point where, you know, we didn't have a seed supplier, most of us, we couldn't even save our own seed and have a crop, right? So if you grow more heirloom varieties, then you're just helping with the genetic diversity of plants and keeping our plant culture as helping to keep those varieties alive, because if people stop growing them, then we don't have them anymore, right? So there are a few. Hope seed is a good one. Everything that they supply is heirlooms. And you can also get things that are well suited to our climate, right? So those are just, so for me, that's a philosophical thing that I'm very concerned about, is one, keeping your soil healthy, and two, trying to keep, the genetic diversity of our food healthy, and sustainability in what we grow. So I think probably can do the next slide. Okay, so this is the time of year when all gardeners start to get excited, even the ones like me that are avid cross-country skiers. I feel like I've split personality, because really I want the snow to stay because I want to ski, but really I want to get gardening. So gardening for success. Okay, so let's pick things that are, like I say, that are easy to start. So basil, parsley, thyme, and I love leeks. I love leeks for this climate because they're easy to grow. They transplant really quite well in our climate, and they can grow right through, you can use them right through the season. So you can start using them when about mid-July. Usually I start to pull some of mine. So I'll overseed them. So when I set them out, I'll start them indoors, and when I set them out, I'll set them quite close together. And as they grow, I'll pull them, right, to give but I was still picking leeks in, I think we pulled December, we pulled the last of our leeks, because they're very frost tolerant. They're like kale in that way. Kale is also another awesome crop to grow for lots of reasons. You can eat it raw, you can cook it, but it grows, again, like we were still pulling kale well into December and using the stuff out of our garden. So it's a nice long growing crop. So if you were going to grow, kale would be another thing you'd want to start kind of mid-March, early April. So what I do with my herbs, I just get, like a little container. I think I have some dollar store ones that fit on my windowsill. And so I'll fill it with soil. I'll quite not super heavy seed it, but I'll seed it pretty heavy, and then cover it. And once the plants start to germinate, then I'll thin them down. So thin them down so that you get some good, strong, healthy plants, and then those can be your plants that you can put. Basil is a good plant because as long as you pull, once it starts to flower, if you take the middle section out of it, it'll keep growing and growing and growing, and you can keep picking it because you just pick the leaves off as you want. And it makes everything more delicious, right? It's a great herb, as is parsley. Parsley's got a lot of really good medicinal purposes, and parsley is a great crop also to grow because it grows really well. Not very many pests. It sometimes gets a flea in it, but it's usually not that hard to get rid of. You just knock them off, and they don't do a whole lot of damage. They're more annoying than anything. So if you want to start a few things, those are good things to start. And so then we get into our early to mid-May crops. These are things that grow better when it's cooler. So they don't do, except for the beets, they're okay, but I plant those early for a specific reason. But the other ones, like the peas and the radishes and the spinach especially, and other green mixes, they grow really well early season. When I grow greens and when I grow, I try to grow mixes of lettuce and mixes of Swiss chard. I have a couple of reasons for that. Looks prettier in a salad bowl, tastes better, but like most crops, within your lettuce mix, You will have some lettuce that's resistant to a certain pest, and maybe the pest will like one kind, but they won't like it all. So if you plant a mix, if you get a pest, you're not going to lose your whole crop, right? And that's what's really frustrating, right? When you plant something, you put all this work into it, and then you end up getting nothing out of it. So if you plant mixes, like Swiss chard, for example, if you plant rainbow Swiss chard, you'll have a red one, a yellow one, and a green one. Well, the leaf miner, which is something that will kind of, it's just exactly what it says, it mines its way into the leaf. Now, my other philosophy in life is, the great thing about free protein is it's free. So, you know, I'm not really easily freaked out by a little free protein. But if you're not a fan of free protein, that's okay. So if you grow a mix of Swiss chard, the leaf miners, they really like the green ones. They're not so crazy about the red ones and the yellow ones. So if they've got a choice, they will kind of invade your green ones. And then you can just hand pick around them, or pick off the green ones and destroy them, right? And then pick, because you can keep, Swiss chard is another one of those crops. If you keep it picked, it will keep producing. Peas are like that as well. I usually grow snap peas. So you have peas that you grow, snow peas for the pods, and then you have peas that you grow for the peas. But snap peas are the best of both worlds. If they get too big, the peas are still really, really yummy. But if you keep them picked off, they will keep producing and keep producing and keep producing. So they're another one of those crops that you get a lot of bang for your buck, right? It'll keep producing and keep producing. Beans are also like that. If your beans get overgrown, then they will stop producing. But if you keep your beans picked regularly, then you get a much longer season out of those things. So beets. When I plant my beets, I would say I would do what you would call overseed, which means that if you were to look at the instructions on the beet seed packet, it would probably tell you to plant them, I think it's an inch or an inch and a half apart, probably, something like that, right? So when I do a crop like that I know is not, again, it's not a heavy feeder, it's a moderate feeder. So it's not going to really impact your soil if you overseed it. So I overseed it, and then as soon as they're, you know, about this tall, well, I start pulling them, and I eat them in my salad first. And then I let the ones grow, and once I get little beets forming, then I'll go through and I'll pick another picking. And this goes on all season till in the end I have some really nice big ones left that I want to pickle or whatever I want to do with them. But in between, it's not something I've had to plant and I've had to wait and 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 wait, right? That's not the kind of crops you want to grow. If you're growing in a small plot and you want to make the most of your garden space, then these are the kinds of things you should grow, right? So when you're buying seed, if you read the seed packet and it says, you know, one package will do so much distance, you got to remember you're going to overseed it. So on those things, so like the spinaches and the lettuce mixes where you're going to maybe plant, like for example, for lettuce, you could plant a little bit, and then 2 weeks later you plant it in another space, and then you could just keep rotating, right? So you got to think, oh yeah, I'm going to plant this multiple times over my season. So I want to buy a bit more of that kind of seed, right? So let's see, did I cover everything? Spinach, radish. Radish, of course, will only grow well early, and radish is really susceptible to little worms, especially as you get into the warmer and like beginning of June, kind of into mid-June, you're going to get, and once you start to pull them, the problem gets worse. So they're one of those crops that, you know, throw a few in if you want, but just throw a few in and use them early, and, you know, don't try to, it's not something that you should try and keep over a long period of time, because they will get worms in them. Let me see. The next one. Okay, so beans. Mid to late May. When I plant my beans, I also beans are, again, they're a moderate feeder, but the good thing about beans is they actually put they're nitrogen fixers. So if you grow your beans and then you compost your beans, even better, but they actually help to fix nitrogen back into the soil. So they're a really good plant for crop rotation. So if you've planted something, if you've had something in one area of your garden and say it was leeks, they're pretty heavy feeders, right? The next year you might want to plant your beans where your leeks were. It's good for disease control, plus it's also good for soil health, right? To rotate things around. So I have, if you were to come to my house and look at my seed box, you'll see all these pieces of loose leaf, and they all have a year. So it'd be like 2013, and I have a map of where I planted everything, going back probably 10 years, right? So I use that when I'm looking at where I want to put things. And I put things in certain places. Sometimes I don't rotate things probably as much as I should, just because it's just a space issue, right? I don't want my peas in the middle of my garden. I find it interferes with some things, so I tend to rotate them back and forth to either end, which probably I should put them in the middle, but anyway. But keeping the same things, I'm getting all these lovely notes. Oh, that's sweet. So, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so, what was I saying? Rotating, right. So, that's another one of those things that helps to keep your soil healthy. So, think about crop rotation, even in a little plot, right? You can still make sure that you move stuff around. So, keep a record, right? Just get a, notebook or something and keep a year-to-year record. My friend, the gardener, one of my really good gardening friends who starts most of my tomato plants, says to me, gardeners always start about mid-June. Well, next year, which means that some of your stuff has probably already failed. And that's the thing, like not getting, I've been gardening my whole life, and I will do the same thing that I've done forever with a certain crop, and it'll be a complete failure one year and it'll be a total success the next. Right? That's why growing a variety of things is really important. So don't get intimidated by the fact that you just have a small spot to work. Still try and grow a variety of things, because every year is a good year for something and a bad year for something else. So don't get caught with just having all one thing, because then you'll be frustrated if you do, that's the perfect year for asparagus beetles and they eat off every cucumber you planted, right? You'll not be a happy camper, which can happen. So leaf lettuce, like I say, leaf lettuce I rotate at about a 2-week. I have a row, and I plant like part of it, and then I usually on 2 weeks later I'll plant another part of it. So I have a continual supply, and you can cut it multiple times, but you'll notice when it's kind of on its last legs, because it'll start to bolt as smaller and smaller plants. And read your seed packets, because some of them are more resistant to heat, better heat tolerant mixtures, right? So there's early season mixtures, there's late season mixtures. And that's what makes it really fun when you can spread, for me, my challenge to myself right now is how long can I extend my growing season? That's what I'm working on right now. I have cold frames. I was picking carrots at Christmas when my granddaughter was down. And there's still a few carrots in there. I just left them there to see what they're going to be like in a few weeks when I can pull them out of the frozen ground. I also have part of a crop of spinach still in a cold frame that I've left, just to kind of see what that's going to look like. So the cold frames we only built last May. So they're a complete new addition to our garden. So we're just playing with them. I actually tried last year putting a cold frame inside my greenhouse, and about mid-April had all my spinach bolt because it was so hot in there. So that obviously was a failed experiment. Won't do that again. So so those are your kind of mid-season. Early June, carrots are a tricky one, because carrots they are one of the longest germinating plants. They take a long time to germinate, and they're pretty particular about their conditions when they germinate. They will not germinate unless the soil temperature is about 15 degrees, which is pretty warm for early season. So don't plant your carrots too early. Don't get caught planting your carrots too early. The other thing about seeds is, general rule, the bigger the seed, the faster it germinates. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. It should be kind of size of seed relative to size of plant almost. So, because spinach seeds, I mean, they're pretty reasonable size. I mean, they're not humongous and they germinate really fast. Some of the lettuce seeds will also, some will germinate faster than others, but for the most part, so carrot seeds are pretty small, so it takes them a long time to germinate. And ants love to eat them. Certain kinds of ants will eat them off. So, especially if it's damp. They like moisture, but they don't like too much moisture. So carrots seem like a really simple thing, and they are once you get them going, right? You got to make sure you thin them because it's nearly impossible to plant carrot seeds without overseeding them because the seed is really small, right? And they actually like to be growing they're like spinach. Spinach actually doesn't like so much to be just exposed in a row. My spinach row is about, what I do is I do a triple row of seed in about a 1 foot square. So I'll make 3 rows and seed the 3 rows together because they like to be crowded almost and they like companionship. And carrots are like that as well. They will do okay in a single row, but you can pack them in a small space, right? You can plant a little bed of carrots and then thin them out and they'll grow quite well. If you get your carrots with a lot of twisted double roots and all kinds of weird stuff going, too much nitrogen, so that's one of those, don't use, that's a bad chemical fertilizer. Too much nitrogen is a problem. Or you got rocks, your soil isn't broken up well enough. So planting shorter carrots, right? So I've got a list in my handout, or a list of some suggested types of carrots. So the rounder, shorter ones are easier to grow, as they don't have to have so much depth to be healthy. Okay, so that's kind of right. So then we get back to, so we planted all the stuff early, and we're reseeding some things like our lettuce mixes, and probably won't need to do your Swiss chard if you keep it cut, but if it gets overgrown on you, you could cut it again. But then we get back into mid to late August, and you can start some of this stuff all over again, right? So when other people are, they've got only tomatoes and beans and cucumbers and their garden is basically done, you can be like, oh, well, here I go again, right? So you can reseed your spinach and leaf lettuce, other greens. If you're going to grow kale, kale is an investment crop. I would call it an investment crop. You're going to have to either buy plants or you're going to have to start it yourself. And you're going to have to invest it needs quite a bit of space. But what I do with my kale is I start picking it as soon as usually about mid to late July. The bottom leaves will start to yellow, and I pick them and use them before they yellow. But it's a good crop as far as it's really disease tolerant, and it's really amazingly frost tolerant, right? Like it'll keep growing and growing, as will Swiss chard compared to lettuce, right? You can grow it like much longer into your season. Okay. Do the next one. Okay, so high yield plants for small spaces. So I've talked about this stuff, right? So peas, dwarf peas versus tall peas, right? So you got to look at who else is around you, what are they growing, and maybe you could share this community garden can get to know your neighbor, and maybe you can agree to put a little fence up and to grow some peas together on the fence. And your peas will be successful again if you keep them picked. So if you're going to grow these and beans as well, you got to really visit them often and pick them often, because once they start to form, because the plant's purpose, what it wants to do is it wants to make new seed. And once you will let it start to achieve that purpose, that's when it will start to slow down. So that's why taking your seed heads out of your basil, so you make it keep growing. And the same thing with parsley, right? When it starts to go to flower, to take that out. If you grow garlic, hardneck garlic, which is what I grow, it'll get a scape in it. And if you cut the scape, then you'll be okay. If not, you'll actually start robbing the garlic bulb of this, and you'll feed the scape instead of the garlic. Garlic you have to plant on Thanksgiving weekend. And you plant it in Thanksgiving weekend and you harvest it in August. So it overwinters. So what you need to plant it early enough so that it can get some roots going to keep it over the winter. And it'll come up through the snow usually. Usually mine is. Lots of compost. It's a heavy feeder. It is a heavy feeder. So you're going to need lots of compost. And if you don't compost yourself, you can always buy compost. But the best way, of course, is to compost yourself. Yeah, so planning your space. So you look at your space and you decide, okay, I'm going to grow a few greens, and you get all excited and you think, well, maybe I should. So you're going to grow some beans and you're going to grow some greens, and so now how do you figure out how to put this stuff? Like, where do you put stuff, right? So you look at your space. You're going to look at how big the plant is going to end up being. And so you want to think about things like, okay, once these bean plants get to be this tall, right? If they're going to shade out, they're going to shade out things. So what you want to plant next to them are things that are okay with the shade. And like I say, a lot of that information is on. You going home to bed? Have a good sleep. Sorry, I won't see you on Saturday. Have a good ski without me. So you're going to want to make sure that when the things are getting big, that you've left enough space for them, right? So you can, but the other thing that you can do is once things have, so for example, if you decide you want to grow kale, well, once the plant really starts to develop, you're going to have space in around it. So that's where you can seed something that doesn't really like a lot of heat in the summer, like spinach, right? So you could actually seed some spinach that isn't a really heavy feeder down in around the bottom of your kale plant, and as you pull your kale plant leaves off, right, it'll come. Swiss chard is another. They're called interplanters. So things that are good for interplant, Swiss chard is another one, because individually they grow quite a number of leaves, and they don't really get upset because they're not heavy feeders. They don't get upset if something's really close to them, right? So you can interplant. Radish is another good interplanter, right? So you can disperse it because it's going to grow early and then you're going to pull it, right? So think about those kinds of things. Well, what can I plant together? And there's all kinds of things on the internet about companion plants. So what plants should I plant together and what plants shouldn't I plant together, right? So there's lots of information available on those subjects. So think about how you're going to arrange your things. So taller stuff together, right? That makes sense, right? So if you're going to do some peas, you might do your peas, and then next to that you might do your beans, because they're both going to get taller, but the peas are going to get taller than the beans, right? Then you might if you're going to put your leeks in, you might put them next to them, and then you might put a few beets in. And then if something fails or something doesn't grow well, right, you can always go back and throw some other seed in between, right? So just thinking about using things that is not a one-time thing. So some of the things I wouldn't recommend if you're a first-time gardener. I wouldn't recommend you try to grow cucumbers. Lots of reasons for that. One of the things about cucumbers is that they are really, really susceptible to, some people call them squash bugs, some people call them asparagus beetles. Even when they're a good-sized plant, these, they can just be killed in, almost seems like overnight, by an invasion of these. You've probably seen them before. They're kind of black, and they're black with yellow stripes, and they're not very big, but they'll suck the life out of a cucumber plant really, really, really quickly. And cucumbers are relatively difficult to transplant. A lot of the squash family is. I do some transplants because I put them in my greenhouse, and I have better success transplanting them into my greenhouse. But the ones that I put outside, I direct sow about mid-May usually, and I have much better success. They like to be grouped together. So if you were doing cucumbers, you'd group them with 3 plants or 2 or 3 plants in a little grouping. But they take a lot of room. They're going to shoot out a lot of vines, right? And you're not going to get, although they are delicious when you grow them yourself, you're not really going to get a big high yield. And if you lose the plant, you know, then you still could plant something else there. But for the most part, they're trickier, right? They're not drought tolerant, so you're going to have to be really diligent about coming to water them. I think there's a slide about that. Yes, yes, plants with challenges. Tomatoes, they're another one. I grow a fair bit of tomatoes, but I've been at it a long time. And the cutworms love your tomato plants. They also like anything in the cabbage family. So if you're trying to grow broccoli, I don't grow broccoli because it's one of those things, I don't want to fight the worms for my broccoli. I just, you know, that's just, I prefer to grow kale because it's just a much better, and I grow Brussels sprouts because they do really well where I am. They're very heavy feeders, but I have my supreme composter who keeps my soil really healthy, so I don't have to worry about having, and kohlrabis, yes. Kohlrabis are another great crop. It's better than growing turnip. Turnip is a challenge because it's really susceptible to wireworm, and clubroot is the other thing. Whereas kohlrabi is that same family, and it has no challenge it doesn't ever get wireworm, and it's way less susceptible to clubroot. And kohlrabi, everybody familiar with kohlrabi? You can eat it, yeah. It's a fairly easy crop to grow. You can do, it says on the seed package that you can start it inside. It does transplant okay, but you can direct sow it because it will grow fairly well early. Like it'll germinate under quite cool conditions. So it's an okay one to do. We grow usually a couple of big rows of kohlrabi actually because we really like it. So it's much better than turnip. Potatoes. You know, unless you're going to grow something that's genetically modified, which I wouldn't recommend, very susceptible to potato beetles, of course. Plus, it uses a lot of room, and we live in a potato growing place, right? So potatoes, we have lots of access to potatoes, and in my opinion, potatoes fresh out of your garden or potatoes, you know, from a good grower, there's really no, you know, advantage. So I wouldn't recommend, just because it tends to bring in disease, right? And when you're growing in a community garden, you don't want to grow things that are going to attract disease for somebody else. And that's the same thing for tomatoes. I see a lot of people do plant tomatoes, and I understand, because what's more delicious than a tomato? But if you're going to grow tomatoes, think about if you have another place you can garden, like if you have a little balcony or something, or if you have a place. Tomatoes have come a long way as far as varieties, so you can get varieties that grow really well in a pot, right? Because tomatoes are one of those things that have to be tended often, have to be fed, right? They're really heavy feeders. So I feed mine with compost tea, but you do have to feed them. So they're not really necessarily a great choice. They're high maintenance, they have to be staked properly, there's a lot of disease. Like I think, maybe not last year, but the year before, almost everybody lost their tomatoes to blight, right? It was a really bad blight year. I did okay because I'm there all the time and I've developed a way to manage that. But when you're new to gardening, tomatoes are and there's nothing more disappointing than having your tomato plant break off partway through the season, and you've invested all that space and all that effort and you to get nothing from them, right? So grow cherry tomatoes in a bucket, right? Like they're a great thing to grow on your patio or and there's lots of great varieties that do really, really well in a reasonable sized container, right? So that's where I suggest you grow those things. And yeah, okay, end of slides. That's it. Let me see, what was the other points I wanted to make? Squash are another one of those things. Summer squash isn't so bad, so if you wanted to grow zucchini and you're a person who uses your zucchini small and you want a good supply of them, again, if you got a bush type of zucchini and you pick them regularly, then you could get a decent supply. And they're a little more challenging to grow, but they're not horrendous. I wouldn't suggest you grow winter squash because it's a super heavy feeder, and and again, it's one of those things you're going to invest all season and you're going to hope that you're going to get something out of it, but not necessarily, right? And if you invest all that space and they flower and then the asparagus beetles get into them and they suck the flowers and then you get one little tiny little squash and it doesn't, you're not going to be happy, right? That's not a way to be successful. So I would avoid those things. Let me see. So some ideas for, so my main points, I guess, about crop selection is, I had for my notes, is choose crops that are expensive but easy to grow with few natural pests. Plant space-efficient crops, right? They provide high yield relative to the space. So those are all your greens. That's my suggestion always for first-time gardeners. Start with greens, beans, and herbs, right? And especially if you're not necessarily going to be able to be here like all the time, you want to come at least once a week, but for some people, you're going to be, if you're going to be away for, an extended period of time, definitely stick to those crops because you're still going to be able to have something in the end. Think about your garden's vertical space, right? So think about taking advantage of some of that. You can't be too overzealous with that in a community garden because you're going to shade somebody else's. But try and figure out a plan maybe with your neighbor to, have something on your common boundary with someone where you can take advantage of your vertical space, right? As well as your horizontal space will give you more yield. And compost. I can't say it enough, compost, because it doesn't matter what you do. It's like me, I've been gardening my whole life, but if I don't look after my soil, all my experience and my expertise doesn't matter a bit because it's just not going to do well unless you have a healthy foundation to grow in, right? I think that's all I had to say, really. I think.
Well, thank you very much, Shelley. Are there any questions that